All right, we're calling to order the last panel of the day. Thank you. I know some of you have been here all day. Some of you have probably just gotten here recently. A series of warning lights. Red means you stop, green means you started, and then yellow, we'll try to wrap it up as quickly as possible. Before we begin the process, I want to introduce all of our panelists, and then we'll begin your presentations for 7 minutes each, and I guess we'll swear them in as well before we begin to question them here. So our first panelist is Ms. Heather McDonald from the Manhattan Institute. Our second panelist is Mr. Fritz Umbach with John Jay College. Our third panelist is Mr. David Klinger from the University of Missouri St. Louis. Our fourth panelist is John Shane with John Jay College. And our fifth and final panelist is Mr. Sam Walker from the University of Nebraska. I'll ask each of you to raise your right hand to be sworn and swear or affirm that the information that you're about to provide us is true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Ms. McDonald, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairman Castro. This is a great honor to be testifying before the U.S. Civil Rights Commission that must be the most incredibly resilient body I've seen, and if any of you keel over during our presentation today, we're not going to take it personally. It's been a long day. Any police shooting of an unarmed, innocent civilian is a tragedy. The police should constantly refine their tactics to try to ensure that such mistakes never happen. Moreover, the police have an indefeasible obligation to treat everyone with courtesy and respect and within the confines of the law. But while we need to make sure that the police are properly trained in the Constitution and courtesy, there is a larger reality behind the issue of policing and race that remains a taboo topic, and that is black crime. Unless we bring down the black crime and victimization rates, policing is going to be heaviest in black neighborhoods, increasing the chances that when an officer use of force goes awry, it will have a black subject. Every year, approximately 6,000 blacks are murdered nationally. This number represents a homicide death rate 6 times greater than the white and Hispanic homicide death rate combined. And that black death by homicide rate is a function of the black crime rate. Black males between the ages of 14 and 17 commit homicide at 10 times the rate of white and Hispanic male teens combined. The black homicide rate for all age groups is 7 times that of whites and Hispanics combined. That crime rate means that police presence and use of proactive tactics will be heaviest in black neighborhoods. In Brownsville, Brooklyn, for example, the per capita shooting rate is 81 times higher than in nearby Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, Brownsville being predominantly black, Bay Ridge being predominantly white and Asian. Every single one of those shootings is going to draw police into the neighborhood where they're going to be looking to make proactive stops to prevent a retaliatory shooting. Now, for the reasons that we have already heard today, saying anything definitive about police shootings is difficult. Historically, around 1/3 of the 400 police homicides reported to the FBI each year have black subjects. Such a figure is easily consistent with the black crime rate. Blacks make up over half of all homicide perpetrators in the country, and in 2013 were 42% of all cop killers, despite being merely 12% of the population. From 1980 to 1998, young black males murdered police officers at almost 6 times the rate of young white males. According to Gary Kleck, a criminologist at Florida State University, police officers are less likely to kill a black suspect threatening or attacking them than a white suspect. Kleck's findings comport with other research on officer behavior. In New York City in 2011, police officers killed 9 suspects, an extraordinarily low number compared with the size of the New York Police Department and the city population itself. Blacks were 22% of those fatalities. Whites were 44% of those police fatalities. Yet blacks were 67% of all suspects who fired at the police. No white suspect fired at the police. A 2014 simulation study out of Washington State University found that officers waited longer to assess the situation when confronted with black suspects than with white suspects. Who are some of the victims of the elevated black crime rate? On March 11th of this year, as protesters once again converged on the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department, a 6-year-old boy named Marcus Johnson was killed a few miles away in a St. Louis park, the victim of a stray bullet fired in a dispute. There were no mass protests over his killing. Al Sharpton did not call for a Justice Department investigation. Few people outside of St. Louis even know the boy's name. As heartbreaking as such killings are, crime rates were much higher 20 years ago. Over 10,000 minority males are alive today in New York City who would have been dead if the city's homicide rate had remained at its early 1990s levels. Behind this historic crime drop lies a policing revolution that began in New York and spread nationally. In 1994, the New York Police Department started intensely analyzing crime data on a daily basis, deploying police officers accordingly, and holding police commanders accountable for crime in their precincts. This data and accountability revolution, known as CompStat, created the longest and steepest crime drop in record. For decades, the rap against the police was that they ignored crime in minority neighborhoods. Today, thanks to CompStat, the NYPD and other data-driven agencies are focused like a laser beam on where people are most being victimized, and again, that's in poor minority neighborhoods. The other determinant of police deployment is community demands for assistance and enforcement. Go to any police community meeting in Harlem, the South Bronx, or Central Brooklyn, and you will invariably hear some variant of the following requests. We want the dealers off the corner. You arrest them, and they're back the next day. Kids are hanging out on my stoop and smoking weed. Can't you arrest them for loitering? The irony is that the police cannot respond to these heartfelt requests for order without generating the racially disproportionate statistics that will be used against them in an ACLU or Justice Department lawsuit. Nearly all police officers choose their careers out of the desire to serve, and a vast majority continue to believe fervently in the good people in the community who support them. These community members are rarely heard in the national media. By all means, let us do everything we can to make sure that police departments use force only as a last resort. But there is no evidence that police shootings of blacks are on the rise or that they are a function of racism, explicit or implicit. In fact, the government agency most dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter is today's data-driven police department, exemplified by the NYPD. If we spent as much time figuring out how to lower black crime as we spend talking about alleged police racism, the alleged policing problem would melt away. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Umbach, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman Castro. Anyone with a conscience viewing the video of Michael Slager killing Walter Scott must share North Charleston Police Chief Trigger's response of being sickened by the event. And the personal testimony today confirms the reality of police use of excessive force. But much about such practices is unknown. Today I want to briefly map out what we do not yet know about the problem and its solutions, and what we do know. What is going to get us the systemic change we all want? The first questions are obvious. How frequently do police use lethal or excessive force, and are they doing so more frequently? Certainly, widespread use of camera phones and social media have brought a welcome national focus on the problem. But is it the focus or the problem itself that is growing? The answer is we don't know, and likely cannot know the scope and trajectory of the problem until we construct a comprehensive national database. It is revealing of our moral compass that we track so much about law enforcement and crime in America, but do not reliably collect data about the police use of serious force. The shortcomings of the DOJ database on officer-involved shootings, the FBI's numbers on justifiable homicides, and the 2014 Death in Custody Reporting Act are all well known, and I need not repeat them here. But until we have reliable numbers, however, it would be irresponsible to speculate about the size and nature of the problem. And certainly the incomplete data we have points in many different directions. Here in New York City, for example, where the police have been exceptionally transparent in their annual shootings report, the incidence of police use of lethal force has been low for decades and shows no sign of increasing. The next obvious question is, do police officers subject minorities to disparate treatment when using serious force? Again, we do not really know. As even ProPublica acknowledged in their off-cited study of the alarming racial disparities in police killings, although they, quote, found evidence of disparity in the risks faced by young black men and white men, this does not prove that police officers target any racial group. The data is far too limited to point to a cause for disparity. No doubt, as Stanford University's Jennifer Eberhardt has demonstrated in her careful studies, implicit bias does shape police officers' behavior. They judge, for example, faces that are the most stereotypically black as the most likely to be criminal. But while implicit bias is certainly real, how much of the clear racial disparities in the police use of serious force it can explain, and how much is best explained by other factors is simply unknown. Implicit bias might contribute significantly or negligibly to police use of force. We just do not know. So if we know so little about the problem, what do we know about the solutions? There are solutions we know work, and then there are solutions that we know don't work, or yet have not yet worked. One of the most frequently cited solutions to the problem of police brutality, increasing the diversity of police forces, has an intuitive appeal, and so has played a central role in calls for police reform for a half-century. But the evidence for the value of this goal is rather mixed. The most rigorous studies have shown that increasing the share of black officers on a police department has only a very modest impact on the frequency of the use of lethal force by that department. And at the individual level, the research consistently demonstrates that black police officers are no less likely to use physical force than are white officers, and some studies show they are actually more likely. And as the recent DOJ study of Philadelphia's police department revealed, black officers were nearly twice as likely to misread harmless objects as weapons, or innocent actions as threatening, what's often called by police scholars as threat perception failure, than were white officers. In short, while cities with more minority residents experience a greater rate of police use of deadly force, police departments with a greater share of minority officers do not experience a significantly lower rate. Of course, there are many arguments for greater diversity in our nation's police forces, but there is not yet evidence that reducing police use of lethal force is one of them. Another frequently proposed solution in community policing has also not lived up to its promise for reducing police violence. In a careful study of sustained excessive force complaints in 232 cities of more than 100,000 residents, researchers found that the extent to which an individual police department embraced community policing had no impact on that department's use of force. And as a recent DOJ report on the San Diego Police Department reveals, even that department's comprehensive embrace of community policing, sometimes hailed as the best of its kind, did not inoculate that force against pervasive sexual abuse of vulnerable citizens by its officers. So what does work? 4 decades of increasingly rigorous studies consistently demonstrate that cops who have been to college are much less likely to use force and are more likely to de-escalate risky encounters with citizens. Recent events demonstrate just how important these findings are. Because the current legal justification for the use of force is so very broad, we should aim to reduce not just illegal or illegitimate police use of force, but also what cops among themselves call lawful but awful use of force. And education seems the way to do so. As one methodologically study recently found, even after controlling for a host of demographic and social factors, encounters involving officers with any college education result in significantly less force compared to those with just a high school education. Critically, however, only those encounters involving officers with a 4-year degree result in significantly less physical force. A 2-year cop shop apparently doesn't help much. And all of this makes sense from the perspective of organizational behavior. Policing is a notoriously difficult activity to supervise. A cop on the beat is about as free from direct immediate supervision as any employee in America is likely to get. And when organizations face steep challenges managing outputs, they frequently turn to managing inputs. And requiring a 4-year college education for police officers might bring about the greatest bang for our buck in the often frustrating world of police reform. Of the 18,000 police departments in the United States, only about 50% of police officers have any college education at all, and only 1% of all police forces require a 4-year college degree. So while the best evidence we have contradicts the often simplistic media portrayal of the problem of police brutality, the evidence does point to a rather simple solution. Require cops to have a 4-year college degree.
Thank you. Mr. Klinger?
Thank you for having me here. Real briefly, Mr. Castro mentioned this piece on CNN that just showed up. I just want to let everybody know that I was misquoted in that piece. So when it says in there that Dave Klinger says police officers shoot to kill, I did not say that. Second thing I wanted to say before moving into the bulk of my testimony, the previous panel there was a discussion about attempting to get better data on police use of deadly force and the argument that we need to get information about situations not just where officers killed people, but also situations where they shot people who survived and shootings where no bullet struck. And to make a very long story short without getting into it, but I would entertain any questions you might have, I put in a grant proposal to the National Institute of Justice last week to pilot a study that would look at all police shootings in 3 major police departments across the country that then we hope would serve as a platform for this type of effort that you were talking about and one of the previous panelists was talking about. But what I want to focus on today basically piggybacks upon what Fritz was talking about in terms of trying to figure out ways to reduce the use of deadly force. And the starting point for understanding deadly force is understanding that law enforcement is a dangerous business. And every year we have some dozens of police officers murdered in the United States. And so we cannot look at the use of deadly force in a vacuum. We have to understand it as a response to the danger that police officers face. With that said, there are ways that we can reduce the use of deadly force because not every time a police officer shoots, he or she should absolutely have done so. And I like to break up shootings that didn't need to happen into really 3 types. The first is what I call a bad actor, a police officer who is a bad, evil individual who wanted to kill somebody, simply a murderer, for lack of a better term. The second type of situation, we have police officers who, for whatever reason, make poor choices. They misread the situation, they believe that their life is in jeopardy, they believe that someone is presenting a threat, and they are just simply wrong. Not an excusable wrong, but simply wrong. They made a really dumb choice. And then the third situation, which is what I want to focus on for the rest of my testimony, is what police officers, and Fritz alluded to it, is poor tactics. And these are situations where police officers, not because they are making a bad choice in the final frame, but rather the way they set up the encounter, find themselves in a situation where a reasonable officer, confronted with a particular situation, would reasonably use deadly force. And in my written testimony, I talked about the Tamir Rice situation in Cleveland. This tragedy is an example of that, where the driver officer places the patrol vehicle about 10, 12 feet away from an individual who has been reported to them to have a gun. The passenger officer spots an individual with a gun, and he's 10, 12 feet away without any cover, and he goes ahead and shoots. The analysis that most people have been taking on that is that the passenger officer made a mistake. He didn't know that the gun that Mr. Rice was carrying wasn't a real gun. Had that been a real gun, we could have 2 dead police officers. And so what I want to do is I want to step back and talk about how it is that when police officers approach situations improperly and place themselves in danger, this can lead to shootings that could otherwise have been prevented. Now, this is not something that is rocket science. This is not something that Dave Klinger made up on the fly. This is something that I was trained in 30-plus years ago as a young police officer with the city of Los Angeles, and something that I was reminded of as a young police officer for the city of Redmond, Washington. And this is how police officers structure things, can create situations where shootings might occur, and can preclude situations from devolving to points where police officers need to use deadly force. And I wrote a piece about a decade ago for something called Ideas in American Policing with the Police Foundation, where I talked about police shootings of this ilk as what Charles Perrault calls normal accidents. That is when things become tightly coupled and when things become interactively complex, bad things are going to happen. And once again, that's in my written testimony for anybody who cares to look at it. And so if we think about police work as complexly interactive social circumstances where 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 police officers, 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 citizens, some may be suspects, some may be hostages, some may be innocent bystanders, whatever the case might be, we can see that Charles Perrault's framework makes sense, that we can have bad things happening. So what can we do in law enforcement? We can teach officers and remind officers to decouple, to reduce the interactive complexity. And there's another line of literature from organizational sociology, social psychology, called high reliability theory that talks about the way that you can reduce situations where bad things happen is by creating particular types of culture, which is a term that we have heard about a lot today, and they talk about the notion of mindfulness. That when members of organizations are mindful, and there's 5 things that I lay out in my written testimony: preoccupation with failure, refusal to simplify interpretation, sensitivity to operations, commitment to resiliency, and then deference to expertise. When we have organizations that operate this way, we reduce bad outcomes. And if police departments can develop this type of mindfulness, my argument goes, they will in fact be able to reduce the number of situations where officers shoot where they didn't need to have to. And I'm going to challenge Fritz's argument about the need to have college-educated police officers. I think that's a good idea for all sorts of reasons. But in terms of the use of deadly force, one of the things that we know is that the most dangerous job that any American citizen can have is being on a flight deck of an aircraft carrier. You've got flight operations where people are loading high-octane jet fuel. You've got 500-pound bombs. You've got missiles. You've got so on and so forth. You've got planes that are taking off. You've got planes that are landing. And you know what? The U.S. Navy has figured out ways to not have accidents. And the last time the U.S. Navy had a fatality in terms of a mass conflagration on an aircraft carrier flight deck was literally decades ago. And one of the ways that they've been able to avoid this is through the process of developing mindfulness among everybody who is on that flight deck. The average age of the people that are working on that flight deck, 19, 20 years old. So organizationally, we can create mechanisms to avoid bad outcomes in situations that are inherently complexly interactive and tightly coupled. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Shane?
Mr. Castro, thank you.
Push the button up.
It's up.
Okay.
You hear me?
Move it a little closer to you.
Better?
Yes.
Thank you. I approach the issue from a knowledge perspective, one where the use of force and information become part of an embedded part of management and are routinely used to examine police policies and practices relative to legal principles and community sentiment as a matter of police performance. It has been said that measurement is the first step that leads to control and eventually to improvement. If you can't measure something, you can't understand it. If you can't understand it, you can't control it. You cannot control it, you cannot improve it. The intent is to control police use of force through training, supervision, and policy development, which is likely to reduce its incidence as well as prevent organizational accidents related to it by capturing, analyzing, and reporting on data to ensure a complete picture emerges about trends and patterns across the nation that can inform local policies and practices. So what is the problem? At present, we do not have good national understanding of police use of force because we do not have good data. Most of what is known about police use of force is the result of sporadic and piecemeal research funded by the National Institute of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and research agendas of a few scholars involving a few cities or single cities. This lack of data and information has led to a fundamental public misunderstanding about police use of force, which is a defining feature of the police role. As a result, emotional arguments filled with red herrings, ad hominem attacks, and non sequiturs replace logic and reasoning that is grounded in fact. Compounding the problem is a present use of force data system compiled by the FBI Uniform Crime Report entitled Justifiable Homicide is meager and relies on summary data. Summary data, or aggregate data as we call it in social science, is a problem defined as information loss which occurs in the substitution of aggregate or macro level data for individual or micro level data, and this limits utility. For example, aggregate data can summarize average characteristics for a group, but it cannot assume those characteristics apply to every member of a group. The reverse is also true, which is reaching a group conclusion, such as a national level picture, based on exceptional cases, which are individual and local cases. Both of these errors point to traps in everyday reasoning, which leads to stereotyping and hasty judgments. We need to determine empirically what individual incidents look like, not just rely on group averages. One proposed solution. The United States law enforcement community needs a more flexible and in-depth data system, a more comprehensive incident-based data system that is disaggregated with micro-level details about the use of force and available for law enforcement executives, researchers, legislators, criminal justice students, and the general public. The best analogy I can offer is Uniform Crime Report versus the National Incident-Based Reporting System, where the UCR is a data summary of crime that occurs across the United States, and NIBRS presents incident-level information about crime. NIBRS enables interested parties to examine crime from its lowest level, which unmasks relationships between victims, offenders, locations, and other incident-level details. NIBRS has been superior at inferential purposes and has been widely used to uncover relationships involving sexual assault of young children, prostitution of juveniles, predictors of homicide clearance, kidnapping of juveniles, child pornography, violent crime, among the many. A similar system would provide the ability to link and analyze detailed incident-level information so we can understand and control the sequence of events that lead to police use of force. That is, the who, what, where, when, how, and why of use of force transactions. So how would such a system work? Participation would be mandatory for all U.S. law enforcement agencies at all levels. Full participation is required for a national outlook. Even large cities such as New York, Los Angeles, Houston, and Philadelphia will not produce enough data in 1 year to make a statistically reliable comparison to identify trends and patterns because police use of force is a very low frequency. The data would be entered into a system similar to the National Information Crime Center, which is known as NCIC, through a web-based application housed at and maintained by the FBI. Legacy data could eventually be migrated to the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research for archival. Such a data system would be consistent with the National Research Platform funded by the National Institute of Justice, the National Data Collection Committee of the Division of Policing at the American Society of Criminology, the findings from a joint report issued by the National Sheriff's Association and the Treatment Advocacy Center on justifiable homicides by law enforcement officers involving the mentally ill, the findings from a recent Police Executive Research Forum study on being proactive about preventing use of force situations, and the Police Foundation report titled 5 Things You Need to Know About Open Data in Policing. So what is the intended outcome? An indispensable tool for managing a police agency is a steady flow of information that indicates performance. Armed with such information, law enforcement executives can proactively manage community expectations and reactions, improve training, supervision, agency policy, and make a stronger case to acquire the resources it needs to be more effective and efficient at delivering police service. Police and community can use the data to confirm or dispel any doubts and answer mutually important policy questions, such as where does the perception of widespread or epidemic of killings of police citizens originate? Is it the media, community rumor, outright lies? How can we control those perceptions? What can the police and community members do together to reduce hostility and misunderstandings between the police and the community? What can the police and community members do together to reduce violent crime and antisocial behavior, which often occasions negative police interaction? What can police and community do to maintain open communication about police use of force, particularly involving officers and citizens of different racial groups or ethnic groups, which is a perennial source of tension? Lastly, unarmed does not necessarily mean not dangerous, so what are the implications for the community when an officer resorts to deadly force after perceiving a dangerous threat from an unarmed person? What are the implications for the officer as well? An incident-driven use of force reporting system is such a tool because it will produce more detailed, accurate, and meaningful data than is currently produced by traditional data summary systems. Some final thoughts. The media frequently seizes on isolated use of force episodes, which distorts the public's perception about the justifiability and rate of use of force. Only with sufficient and reliable data can we estimate the incidence and prevalence of use of force, and only after we have a factual understanding of the nature and extent of use of force can terms such as crisis, epidemic, widespread, discrimination, and disparate treatment be applied in the public discourse. To do so beforehand, as has been done in the recent past, is irrational, irresponsible, and counterproductive to promoting desirable police-community relationships. As a nation, we are best served by experts who act and opine from the head based on attributes that are directly relevant by those who have devoted themselves to understanding the complexity of police work and who can guide rational discussion toward a productive outcome. We are not well served by dilettantes who act and opine from the heart based on attributes that are easy to evaluate or with incomplete information. Thank you.
Mr. Walker.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the Commission for this opportunity to speak today on this very important topic. You'll pardon me if I tell you I've been telling my friends back in Omaha that the Commission has saved the best for last today. I want to begin my testimony by associating my remarks with the testimony of Ellen Scrivener in the previous session. She is absolutely right when she said that we are at a pivotal historic moment in the history of policing in this country. The moment is here. These hearings are extremely important in that regard. And I also want to associate myself with her view that we need to think in terms of systemic police reform, systemic organizational reform. Now, I have chosen on this occasion to focus on 3 specifics, but I believe that they work and are effective only in the context of broader reforms. What I have offer you today is a three-part recommendation. One involves a respectful policing initiative. The second involves de-escalation policies for police departments. And the third are early intervention systems. Now, a respectful policing initiative, I gave similar testimony to the President's task force in January. What it means that we have a serious problem in this country of officers using offensive language, including racial and ethnic slurs, common vulgarities, and worse. This happens all the time. This is a national problem. This happens day in and day out. And it has several different harms. First of all, it's an injury to the person to whom it is directed. Second, it harms the community because these events accumulate over time, particularly in African American communities and low income, high crime neighborhoods. Third, many of these incidents escalate up into more serious incidents involving use of force or even deadly force. Third, when they go unpunished, and that does appear to be the case, it undermines the standards of professionalism within the department. So there are four specific harms. Now, how do we achieve this? Well, the President's interim report adopted the recommendation that we put a stop to this problem. They did not accept my recommendation that all departments be required to conduct annual in-service training on respectful policing, and that they do that by making federal funds, federal Justice Department funds, contingent upon a certification of that training program occurs, annual in-service training. I didn't think they were going to accept that part of the proposal, but I thought I'd put it on the table and make them think about it anyway. So I think what it can do, respectful policing, it's not soft policing, it's not being nice, it's being firm. So for example, in a jaywalking incident, an officer can say, "Sir, I want to ask you to walk on the sidewalk. You are a danger to yourself and a danger to traffic. I'd like to move now." That's not disrespectful, that's not offensive, it's firm, it's law enforcement, it's maintaining order. What I believe can happen is that if officers in a department and in communities over time are respectful in that regard and not using all the offensive language, you will begin to develop a culture of mutual respect and trust. And we will have fewer confrontations between police officers and citizens. They will have fewer instances of use of force and so on. And that will build legitimacy, trust and legitimacy in the police. The President's task force put a huge emphasis on legitimacy because that leads to cooperation by people with the police in terms of reporting crime, reporting neighborhood problems, becoming witnesses in criminal cases. So respectful policing is effective crime control, and it is a cornerstone of effective crime control. Now, the second part of my recommendation is de-escalation. That is where officers respond to a perceived, disrespect or hostility without escalating up. We have a very unfortunate tradition in policing in this country. It acquired a label a number of years ago. It's called contempt of cop. And so the police officer sees, little disrespect, non-cooperation, hostility, and the officer says to himself, "Okay, I'll show you who's in charge here." And force then escalates. So de-escalation goes hand in hand with respectful policing, and you'll get all of the same benefits, especially in terms of crime control and community trust and legitimacy. The third part of my proposal calls for early intervention systems. I don't know if anybody has testified about them so far, but they are computerized databases of officer performance. There may be as few as 5, there may be as many as 25 performance indicators, uses of force, citizen complaints, the outcomes of the investigations of those. You can put in arrests, resisting arrest charges are always a good indicator, traffic stops, and so on. And then when you run the numbers, it always turns out that at the far end, you have a small group of officers with higher problematic incidents, we will call them, than the average officer. And especially if you do a peer analysis. So, for example, those in Omaha, those working South Omaha, the 4 to midnight shift, need to be compared with themselves because those are similar work environments. And you can identify them. You can then, dig deeper into their record. It turns out for really bad officers, all the other officers in the department know who they are and don't want to work with them. And you can then tailor an intervention, whether it's counseling by a supervisor, it might be retraining on particular tactics, it might be professional counseling on substance abuse, family problems, and so on. And then those officers are subject to monitoring, say, for maybe 6 months or a year, and you see if their performance has improved or not improved. So those are 3 specific proposals. But again, we need to put those in the framework of a comprehensive organizational reform, the key elements of which are policy, training, and supervision. So all 3 of those. I created the acronym PTSR, policy, training, supervision, and review. Departments need to become self-reviewing, self-monitoring to see what they are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Folks may have noticed, Dr. Galladay from our Office of Civil Rights Evaluation joined us up here on the podium. I invited him to participate in this section because it involves researchers and data, and that's his job for us at the commission. So when I open it up for questions, I'm going to also give Dr. Galladay that opportunity. Mr. Shane, I want to make sure I'm understanding what you were testifying. I believe you indicated that, as it relates to solutions, we really can't opine until we have complete information. Now, if we were to follow that line of thinking, there's so many things that I can imagine we would not have addressed. For example, when we had our hearing on sexual assault in the military, there's questions as to whether or not the full universe of violations there are being reported or not. To not take any action or come up with solutions in the interim, even though we may not know the full extent of the problem, would leave many people still subject to rapes and abuses. If we looked at educational access, I'm the product of Head Start and Affirmative Action, which is based on testing for disparate impact in access to education. Without those programs, which I benefited from, I wouldn't be sitting here asking you those questions. So I think there is an important steps and solutions we could take short of knowing the full gamut of a problem. Wouldn't you agree, or am I misunderstanding what you're suggesting?
Well, slightly. I don't want to give you the impression that we have to have 100% information, because that answer never happens. We never have 100% information. There's always a dark figure of something that's not reported, something we don't know about. What I am suggesting is that without data, what happens is the heart fills in the blanks. We fill in things through vicarious experience. We look for variables and attributes that are easy to fill in, that are known to us, such as age, sex, race.
But we do have data. We just maybe not have all the data.
We don't have very good data because it's at the aggregate level. It's not at the fine incident level where we're able to measure interactions between the officer, the offender, the location, and all the other situational aspects that go into use of force. It's not enough to be to say we have 150 police officers killed every year, and we know nothing about the various incidents that take place, or the offenders that do these things, or the environment under which these occur.
So in the Jim Crow South, if we were to go back in time and this commission was down there at the time, say, well, we may not know all the reasons that a particular local jurisdiction is denying those black voters the right to vote. We do know that, there does seem to be some disparate impact there, but we don't know what the registrar is saying, what's happening when that person comes to register, what all these additional details are. I would not take action under your description.
No, I'm not suggesting that you don't take action. What I'm suggesting is that the action be predicated on the best data you have. And we know that we can get better data. We don't have it. And what happens is, when we don't have it, people fill in those attributes with things that are completely inaccurate. And we're seeing a lot of that in policing today. A lot of people have a fundamental misunderstanding about how policing works, the interactions that take place, all the contextual variables. We jump to conclusions about the fact that someone is unarmed, that suddenly means they are not dangerous. There's been testimony about the Tennessee versus Garner incident today, some of which has been flawed. Those people don't know what they're referring to. They don't understand the facts. And when we have facts, we make better decisions than we do when we rely on emotion.
I'm sure some of my colleagues will follow up. I'm going to move on to Mr. Umbach. Interesting proposal you have about college education. Were you able to look at in this study? I think you also mentioned a little bit about not having all the data and not coming up with solutions. But you come up with a solution saying, hey, let's have all cops have a 4-year degree. Do you look at where those police officers are deployed? Because you indicate they therefore have less likelihood of being involved in lethal interactions with the public. Does it mean that maybe they're being deployed because they have a college education to more affluent communities, or perhaps they're no longer beat cops, maybe they're a desk sergeant or they're a captain or something else? Do you account for that in your study or your proposal?
All good questions. That statistician. First of all, I want to make clear that this is not my own research. I'm surveying the broad literature of the past 15 years on this. And yes, they're controlling for deployment practices, experience. Obviously, an officer with a college degree is likely to be older than an officer without a college degree. And so you have to compare apples to apples with officers of the same age, the same length of experience, the same deployment practices. And the most methodologically sophisticated studies do all the things that you suggest. And the finding holds true throughout. In addition to the reduced use of force, to piggyback on Ms. Scribner's comments, if we want systemic cultural change, what we know is that cops who've been to college are more amenable to change. They take direction better, they understand institutional goals better, and they're willing to change. We often talk about changing police culture as bending granite. Well, it turns out that cops who've been to college are a little softer. They are willing to change. And so it's not just reducing use of lethal force or de-escalation, all of which is the evidence makes clear, but it's the systemic cultural change that we're all after that's going to be easier with a police force that's more educated.
Thank you. Commissioner Cladney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Klinger, Professor Klinger, I
Yes, sir.
apologize. I read with great enjoyment your paper. And
Thank
so
you.
these highly reliable organizations, I mean, I got like a whole thing I could talk about before I ask you the question. But the question basically is, you want to change the entire culture of the police department, the way
Yep.
they look, the way they operate, and all that. And just like Professor Umbach, he wants all these policemen to have a college education. Well, that's not going to happen because it's too expensive. You got to pay them more money. You got to educate them and all that. I mean, if that's what you want, that's what it is. And I'm just talking off the top of my head, of course. But with you, it's changing the entire culture. It's changing a culture that has been, like you said, bending granite. It hasn't changed a lot in many, many decades. And even Mr. Walker, Professor Walker, he was quoted yesterday in the paper talking about police unions having to change. He says, it's important for unions to become honestly self-critical about police conduct and not blindly defend each and every egregious incident by officers. And officers defend each and every citizen. I mean, I forget who just said this, but officers on the police department know who the bad officers are. And so my question is, how do you propose to go into the depth of detail and change that you've put forth in your paper?
Basically, what I would argue is that the fundamental tactical training is something that every officer in the United States gets to some degree or another. And so the first step is to make sure that every officer who goes through a basic police academy gets the appropriate tactical training about creating distance, time and space, how to interact with people. This includes some of what Sam was talking about in terms of de-escalation, because if you think about it, when there's a distance between you and an adversary, then there's going to be less of that personal involvement. But at any rate, get everybody trained up. One of the things that we know is that some states around the country do not require satisfactory number of hours in fundamental tactical training. They might get a little bit of it in the academy, but no force-on-force training, not appropriate scenario-based training. And then what you start to do in terms of building up the organizational culture aspect of it is you have to make sure. One of the things I talked about was up and down the entire chain of the command. The chief needs to understand this. His or her underlings need to understand it. The patrol supervisor needs to understand it. The watch commander, lieutenant, and the line supervisors need to understand it. And then what you do is you start to create an environment where if Klinger and Shane are on patrol and Walker is our sergeant, he rolls up as we are just done with a situation where there's a call of a man with a gun or something. He debriefs us. He makes sure that we did the appropriate stuff. If we didn't do the appropriate stuff, he goes, hey guys, remember, you pulled up a little bit too close. You engaged this individual too quickly, whatever the case might be. And once you start getting that ingrained in the culture, talking about bending granite, if you ingrain that, that becomes the granite. High expectation of appropriate tactical performance, and we're not going to put up with inappropriate tactical performance. What we're going to do is we're going to teach you how to do it right, and we're going to hold you accountable, once again, up and down the chain. Oftentimes what happens is the chief says, I wash my hands of this. My guys should know better. Well, sometimes the chief doesn't know what he or she's talking about. And so what we need to do, in my opinion, National Academy needs to talk about this at the FBI. We need to start promoting people based on their tactical acumen instead of their ability to know the manual, so on and so forth.
Well, I understand that, but is that done, is the debriefs and people doing stuff wrong, is that done when you talk about accountability? Is that done in an environment where the police officers are able to be open without a disciplinary problem, unless, of course, it happens over and over again where Professor Walker talks about the early warning system, the early intervention system. Or, I mean, because that's what police officers are going to be concerned about when they have to, they want to back up their mates. They want to make sure nobody gets in a jam, at least even in the Navy.
You're absolutely right, and that's one of the things that James Reason wrote about that I mentioned at the back half of my written testimony about creating a just culture. And a just culture is one where the basic assumption is that the officer is trying to do his or her job correctly. And so when there's a tactical miscue, we correct the tactical miscue. Only when someone is acting in bad faith do we then move towards discipline. And without getting into the weeds too much, James Reason talks about this in his book. It's cited in there, and I'd love to talk to people ad infinitum. One last thing, sir. I've taught this normal accident theory and this high reliability organization to cops in Texas. The light bulb goes on, they get it.
Okay. Professor Shane,
Yes.
do you agree with that approach, or an approach like that? Do you think that officers can honestly approach issues of tactical or strategic problems?
Yeah, I do. A couple of reasons why. First, let me add just a little bit to what you were talking about in this non-blaming culture. I'm involved in a project right now with the Police Foundation who is looking at organizational accidents, and we are piloting a system that allows police officers around the country to anonymously report near-miss accidents, borrowing from the aviation industry, the oil and petroleum industry, medicine, and all these other areas that have had near-miss accidents, so we can get a better handle on the finite details of how these accidents actually evolve and play themselves out. That's number one. Number two, I wrote a piece recently, a monograph that was published about organizational accidents, and I borrow from Reason's theory, and I apply it to a case where someone was mistakenly arrested, held for prosecution, ultimately released before the prosecution took place. And when we apply Reason's framework, we find out that there were about 45 different pieces or errors of information that took place, and more errors of omission were prevalent than were acts.
So it would be fair to say that even though we don't have enough data, you believe there should be some change in the culture.
I believe that there should always be the continuation to search for better data and to bring things down to its lowest level, not stay at a high aggregate level. And I do agree that there should be things that you approach and make change on.
Okay, thank you. Professor Walker.
Well, I want to comment on that. I'm a little dubious about the reporting anonymously. I think a police officer with the awesome powers of a law enforcement officer of arrest and the power to take human life, they need to answer honestly to supervisors for their actions. Now, there's a different way of getting at that, because I mentioned this PTSR, framework. The review means the department, on a regular basis, annually, ought to do a review of incidents that have occurred. Maybe there are high-speed pursuits and accidents and so on, or the shooting incident, and you go back and reconstruct this is internally. This is not Justice Department coming. This is internally, and you're looking at, did officers do things, make decisions that could have been different, that would have had a different outcome of that incident, that might have avoided a tragedy that occurred. So I think that's the way you get at the kind of information that you're talking about. There are different paths to changing the culture of a department.
I think that people should stand up and say what they believe, but I think police officers and that department kind of mentality is very difficult to change. I think I've actually represented a police department at one time, and boy, to discipline an officer, you got to have them in a corner for other people to come on board.
May I comment on that?
Sure.
Police departments are not granite. They're organizations. They're organizations with people, and they're very complex. They're far more complex than granite. Granite's a rock. And just I began my career in 1974 teaching. And in 1974, the current deadly force policy was just beginning. It actually originated with the New York City Police Department. That's common. That changed. That just changed a lot of behavior. I do believe that actually we've gotten rid of a lot of the bad shootings. Some other things have happened along the way. But in 1974, the term domestic violence was only just beginning to appear in the field of criminal justice. Well, today, I think probably every police department has, some domestic violence policy guiding officers on how they should handle those kinds of incidents. It's a major change. In 1974, few departments had really restrictive policies on high-speed pursuits, which are very dangerous incidents, and we've brought those under control in many ways. In short, police departments are not granite. They change. They have changed. And all of those, the three that I mentioned, have changed the culture of the departments in the sense of what officers know they can get away with and what they can't get away with. So I am guardedly optimistic about the future because departments ain't granite, and the possibilities of change are very real. We just have to take advantage of this opportunity to continue the reforms that we have made.
We're going to, one more, well, I want to move on. We'll come back.
Okay,
I think
fine.
we'll have some time. Commissioner Timmons-Goodson will be followed by Commissioner Yaki, Dr. Galladay, and Commissioner Achtenberg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our panelists. We all recognize that there's someplace else that you could have been rather than being with us, but you chose to be with us, and we are in your debt for that. My question is for Ms. McDonald. I listened to your oral testimony, and I read your written testimony, and is it your position that the commission should not be spending our time on this issue of policing and excessive use of force?
I think it's a worthy topic to look at. Every police shooting that is unjustified of an innocent person, as I say, is an absolute tragedy.
Okay, thank you. Now, a part of your testimony it actually says that two-parent households, or the lack of them in black communities, is the reason or the major cause for the problems that you see in the black community. I was wondering, in many of the recent cases involving excessive use of force by law enforcement against black males, I'm going to presume that unless you tell me otherwise, I'm going to presume that the police officers didn't know whether the black male came from a two-parent versus a one-parent household. And so how is coming from a two-parent household going to prevent a police officer from using force or excessive force on an unarmed black male walking or riding in the neighborhood?
Well, my point was that the black crime rate, which is very, very elevated compared to the national average, needs an explanation. There are young black men who are being killed at 10 times the rate of white and Hispanic young black men combined. I think that is an equal problem, at the very least, to unjustified police shootings. There are many, many more thousands of black men who are gunned down by other blacks than by the police. And again, every time a representative of the law uses force without justification, that is a horrific abuse of power. But if you want to bring down the black crime rate, which I think is the reason, it's not I think, it is the reason why police are overwhelmingly more disproportionately represented in black communities, you're going to have to ultimately, I think, make sure that more young black men are being raised by their fathers.
Now,
So that's not, your question is bringing together two different phenomenon. I'm not saying that any police officer is engaged in a use of force, justified or unjustified, based on whether the target comes from a fatherless home. But I am saying that ultimately I think any discussion of policing crime and race cannot ignore the black crime rate. And if we want to look at causes, I think family breakdown is, for me, the most salient.
for you. Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the statistics show that folks are more likely to be victimized by individuals that they know, that they're familiar with. So that's in the white community as well. Isn't that the case?
That's certainly true in gang shootings. It may be the case.
So it is not your understanding that individuals tend to be victimized by individuals that they're familiar with, that they know?
That's true, but the rate of victimization by people that you're familiar with is, when you take all ages combined, when it comes to homicide, it's 7 times higher for black males than for whites and Asian and Hispanics combined. I would say that is also a problem worthy of national attention. By all means, let's do everything we can to bring police use of force down. I would disagree with the sense of the panel, as I understand it, except for the last observations by Professor Walker, that police culture has not changed. I think it has changed enormously for the better over the last couple of decades. Policing is far more professional than it ever was. Police corruption is down. Police use of force is way down. I totally agree with Professor Walker that police courtesy is a constant deficit that departments have to work at. But my point is that there is a tsunami of violence in the black community, and that's why police are there disproportionately. And you are not going to bring the police use of force to equal levels as it is against whites and Asians until you bring down the black crime rate. Because as Justice Department studies have shown again and again, the most important predictor of police behavior is civilian behavior.
Do you believe that if law enforcement were targeted or used in the white areas more frequently, that there would be greater incidents uncovered or discovered of crime?
The reports, the data on crime, at least in New York City, comes exclusively from the victims of and witnesses to those crimes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Yockey?
Yeah, not quite sure how to follow that. You know, one of the reason why we are here as a commission, I believe, and one of the reasons why there's been such anger in communities like Ferguson, North Charleston, Staten Island, is because promises made nearly a half century ago with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act haven't happened. And the anger in the community that was supposed to benefit the most from these programs, the African American community, rises from those promises that have been unfulfilled. And that is in part why we are here today, because were we to have a different society, we could talk about this in a much different place, or maybe not even at all. But here we are in a situation where we have something that comes up time and time again. The issue of police misconduct, the issue of whether there's accurate data, the issue of what is it that we're going to be doing about it. And I just wonder at what point are we ever going to get this thing right, and what is it that we have tried in the past 20 or 30 years that hasn't worked as well as it should. By the way, Mr. Klinger, I read your words on CNN. I just want to say I don't see anything really wrong. You may not think they quoted you accurately, and I understand that. Believe me, as someone who's been in politics as long as I have, I'm very sensitive to that fact. But from the testimony given earlier today by others in law enforcement, what have you, I don't think that what you said is too far.
I just didn't want anyone to think that I said the purpose of police officers putting bullets down range is to kill someone. That was the only issue.
No, I understand that. But you know, when I read what you had to say, and I understand it completely. The idea that you call it the normal accident, I look at it as the accident waiting to happen. When you create the circumstances that cause the eventual outcome, whether you call it the accident waiting to happen, you call it the normal accident, or I call it you sit there and you put gasoline on the fire when you drive up to within three yards of a 12-year-old holding a mock rifle, and you have no ability to make a determination in the 2 seconds it could take that person to turn around or not, and have relatively much higher aim than if you were 25 yards away. You're putting gasoline on the fire. Mr. Walker, I've been, even as like an official, sometimes policemen don't recognize you sometimes, and they call you names when they tell you to get out of your car or what have you. And I understand how that goes from a personal point of view, from an entire body of people's point of view. I can understand how that rage would just simmer beyond. But the question I really want to ask is this an issue of resources? Because having gone through this in San Francisco and in other areas, you'll always hear people say, well, we could do it, but for money, for training, but for we need the $5 million training simulation center, right? But for all these things, we could do all these things. But is it really possible, or is part of the inherent problem the blue wall that will always continue to be there? Do we need more of what Mr. Walker calls early intervention? Other people call it early warning. I call it find some way to get leverage to get some of these bad cops out sooner. How do you do that? We seem to be repeating ourselves on this issue time again, and it's getting worse. And if you measure the sentiment in the African American community, it's getting worse. So instead of just talking about data and talking about training, what is it that we can really do, real world, realistically? Is it about money? Is it about leverage, using money on police departments? What is it, I guess? Because I'm grasping for it myself.
Well, at the basic level, it has nothing to do with resources. It's basic supervision. We have standards of performance with police officers involving how to make an arrest, how to do a search, use of force, use of deadly force, everything. I'm saying that we need to emphasize language offensive language as something that's unacceptable. We wouldn't accept teachers calling students names in a classroom. And so at one level, no, it's not a resource problem. It's a commitment level. It's a commitment problem.
Mr. Klinger?
I would say that I agree with Sam in terms of it's a commitment issue largely, but there is going to there will need to be some training done for the tactical part that I'm talking about. Sam's absolutely right. You just tell people, don't talk this way. It's not difficult. You just say that in roll call. Don't say these words. If you do, we're going to gig you. Right, Sam? Okay. Yep. But what I'm talking about is going to take a little bit of time in terms of training. So over the next few years, perhaps, curriculum is written in every state. Here's what you're going to do. As a supervisor, you're going to talk to your troops, don't use this language, and you're also going to learn how to be tactically proficient yourself so that you know what you're supposed to be doing. And like I said, go back to the FBI National Academy. If you want to promote in a major metropolitan police department, you better know about command and control. You better know about what appropriate tactics are, why you don't rush into a house, why you stay outside unless there is a crisis ongoing in the house, so on and so forth. So it will take a little bit, but not a lot.
I have to disagree.
Okay.
I mean, you're talking about individuals who are at their most basic in a fight or flight mode in terms of making decisions, just like that when they encounter a situation. When you look at like an airplane pilot who needs 10,000 hours of training in order to react to what happens when something goes wrong, and it's about repetition. That to me is more than just telling someone how to do it. It's more than just 5 hours or 10 hours of training. It's probably hundreds of hours of training, time and again, to make sure these individuals don't react the way we don't want them to in the situations that you're talking about.
That's a component of it, but let's think about something as simple as a South Carolina tragedy where we have what appears to be a criminal act. Why is that officer by himself tying up with an individual when he is in foot pursuit? Why not wait for 2 or 3 other officers to get there? The guy's going to get tired eventually, and when he's tired, he's not going to be much good at fighting, and you take him into custody then. It's that simple. Those are the types of principles that you can teach officers. Don't close that gap unless you have sufficient backup. Very simple. It's not. It really isn't that difficult.
I just disagree. I just don't think that someone in that decision always makes the smart idea unless they've had it drilled into them to the point where it's automatic. And I don't think.
I don't disagree, but it is drilled in from day one in the academy, all you're in service, and up and down the chain of command.
Well, okay.
Okay. Dr. Galladay, and Commissioner Achtenberg, Commissioner Harriet, myself, and Commissioner Narasaki.
Thank you. I just had 3 questions, one for Mr. Klinger, one for Mr. Umbach, and one for Mrs. McDonald. I'll begin with Mr. Klinger. Mr. Shanes seems to suggest that we know little about the interactions between police shootings in the community, mostly the urban inner city communities.
Could you check your mic, Dr. Galladay? I think it might be
I'm
off.
sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Now we can. Yeah.
Mr. Shane's comment seems to suggest that we know little about the interactions or the micro dynamics of police shootings, which I reviewed your work for St. Louis Police Department. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of the methodology you used and what we learned from those police shootings that you studied, that data you studied in St. Louis?
Sure. And this is part of the basic work that launched this research proposal that I put in last week. And what we did is we drilled down into the investigative case files for St. Louis City Police Department. And what we did is we were able to extract all sorts of information, time of day that the situation occurred, how many officers were on scene, how many suspects were on scene, the characteristics of the suspects, the characteristics of the officers, the weapons involved on both sides, whether shots were fired by a suspect, how many rounds police officers discharged, presence of bystanders, the geographic location. And so what we were able to do is we were able to then map where in St. Louis the shootings occurred, and that was the basis for the report that you looked at. And one of the things that we found was that once you control for levels of violence across St. Louis neighborhoods, race washes out, socioeconomic status washes out, and what's really driving the use of deadly force in St. Louis, at least, is the levels of violence in the community. And one of the things that we say, it was a paper I did with Rick Rosenfeld, Dan Isom, who used to be the chief in St. Louis, and a graduate student by the name of Mike Deckard. At any rate, what we were able to demonstrate was that this is what's going on in St. Louis, and then at the end we said, we have no idea if this is what's going on in Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Baltimore, and that's why we're calling for a national database. And we looked at not just those shootings that resulted in fatalities, but woundings and off-target shots. So what we're looking at is deadly force, and this is not something that I invented. This is something Jim Fife did with the city of New York, literally 40 years ago, using data from the early 1970s. And Jim called for the national database. Others have called for the national database over the years. And so when you have this fine-grained information that John is talking about, we're then able to really look carefully at what is going on in the microdynamics of shootings, as well as plotting them across space and time.
What's the effort to bring that type of effort to scale? So if we wanted to duplicate that into other areas, what's the needed resources?
What we would need is we would need literally millions of dollars to get the data collection system up and running, piloted, squared away, and then have a computer interface similar to what John was talking about in terms of this police foundation process for reporting the near misses. But what I envision is at the end of the month or at the end of the year, what happens is someone from the crime analysis section of every police department across the country, they go to the computer and it says, what day did this happen? You type that in, and then you go to the next screen, the next screen, the next screen, and then it goes to the FBI, Bureau of Justice Statistics, eventually going to be archived at ICPSR. And that's going to take some money. And I think that working with BJS, FBI, whoever, there are people out there that know how to do this, myself included at the lower rung, but there are people that really have a lot of experience with this, but it's going to take a few $million and a few years to get it up and running, because we want to get all the bugs worked out, and we want to get it so that we know that once the whole national database system is spooled up, we've got all the bugs out so that we're not finding problems with it. And so we have to pilot it, and we have to pilot it appropriately.
I believe you had 5 levels or 5 tiers of neighborhoods that you looked at in that particular study. My
Right.
question to you, was poverty an important predictor of police shootings?
It washed out.
Okay,
And
thank
one last thing. Another thing that's interesting is we had to have a curvilinear relationship. I don't know if you remember that, but in the highest violence communities, at least in St. Louis, fewer shootings than in the mid-level violence communities. Interesting finding.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Umbach, my question for you, I know that your testimony today focused more so on educational attainment as a way for probably addressing police shootings. But I looked at your published work, and it focused more so, I think it looked at, if my memory serves me correctly, that the centralization of the NYPD, where at first you had the housing department, police, and then you had the Port Police, but became centralized, and somehow that was a factor contributing to the tension between certain communities here in New York. And I just wanted to ask you to kind of talk a little bit more about that and how that can help inform strategies to get us beyond the issue of police shootings in the communities.
One of the astounding things about the history of police brutality in New York City is the shocking difference between the level of civilian complaints against what was known as Big Blue, right, NYPD, and the housing police. By 1980, about 1 in 3 officers in the NYPD had a civilian complaint. For the housing police, it was less than 1%. And astounding differences, right? I mean, for criminologists who are used to dealing with disparate rates, that's astounding. And one of the important factors was the fact that the housing police had a micro precinct system. Mm-hmm. There were reporting rooms that the police turned out from that were in every housing development. And as opposed to a large geographical unit where the cops were remote, in fact, the precinct was local. They could talk to the cops every day. And this allowed a certain amount of community leverage and input in the nature of policing in public housing for many years in New York City. And until about 1985, public housing was safer in New York City than the surrounding communities.
So the question I asked to you, I have, I guess, as a follow-up question. You look at your concept of, I guess, educational attainment, and what seems to be suggested from your written work is community policing. Which one would those be? Would you say would be important in terms of helping us get beyond the problems of police community tensions and police shootings?
There's any number of reasons why I think educational attainment is important, but it's because it's so very difficult to manage outputs in policing. And I absolutely agree with Professor Walker that NYPD brought down shootings dramatically in the 70s as a consequence of Fife's work, and that police departments do change. But if we can change the inputs, we automatically change the outputs. And there are times when it's hard to get college graduates to go into policing, but at levels of high unemployment among college graduates, now is an ideal time to require that cops have college degrees. It makes a big difference. It is along with civilian behavior, the next best predictor of whether or not an encounter is going to end up violent between civilian and police.
Dr. Galladay, I'm going to move on to some commissioners, and if we have time, we'll come back if you have any extra questions. Commissioner Achtenberg?
I just have two small questions. No, seriously. So this mandatory nationwide system, database, disaggregated data collection, Mr. Shane, Professor Shane, we heard from Mr. Sable from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, I believe, that's where he's from, that he thought, I guess it wasn't, he thought mandatory might not be a very good idea. I'm more of the command and control school, even though I understand that it's not always appropriate. I'm wondering why you say mandatory nationwide, and what other attributes of the system does there need to be in order to get us once and for all a set of data that we need to have some meaningful analytics when it comes to addressing this problem?
Well, in terms of mandatory, we're not going to reach full compliance, I think, unless we mandate it. We have relatively good voluntary compliance with the Uniform Crime Report, and we know that there are issues with that. I think if you mandate it and it becomes a routine part of organizational culture and organizational performance, you're more likely to go back to the system, to pull data out of it, to self-reflect, to look at what neighboring communities are doing, not necessarily because it is voluntary. As far as the attributes are concerned, I think what Professor Klinger said is correct. You have to get down to the lowest level, and we're doing that in piecemeal part right now with for his research, for example. But we're not doing it throughout the United States, and that's what's really important. Most police departments today, as we sit here, have access to the National Crime Information Center, which is called NCIC. In that framework, somewhere, we could also replicate a system that we are talking about that would capture some of the data that he's discussed, that I've discussed, and make it available right there on the terminals that they have now using that current infrastructure.
Do you all concur that if that were to be a tool at our disposal, we would be better off as a result with regard to this particular issue? Is that a point of agreement?
Absolutely.
Yes, and one point just to piggyback on a point John said that he implied is police agencies and police trainers can look at the data, and that will assist police officers doing a better job and make policing safer.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? I had always assumed that the reason we weren't mandating it already was that the feds, we couldn't actually constitutionally do that unless we tied it to a federal program.
That's probably correct. I think there's federalism issues, new federalism.
Okay.
Would probably
I just wanted to be
prohibit us from
clear
doing
that it wasn't so easy to say, no, let's just mandate it. So.
Well, no, I think
you tie it to I mean, they all receive federal. If they want to,
right,
if they want to get tanks and bazookas, they can mandatory report it.
No, I just wanted to be clear that there's a
Sure.
limit.
No. I mean, no. Absolutely.
And I think that's how we did it with DWI. By the way, we tied it to highway funding. So
exactly, of course.
It's easily done.
Yes.
No, you make a good point, Commissioner.
Professor
I
Walker?
understand.
Agree.
I'm sorry. You had something you wanted to add, because then this is my second question.
Go ahead, yep.
No.
Okay. Jim Chanin, who has done such incredible work in terms of putting the Oakland Police Department in receivership, and 10 years later actually helping them make enormous improvements in the way they perform. He observed that this supervisory accountability, he thought, had been a really key element of what had changed, not the only one, but one of the ones. Supervisory accountability is what he identified it as, where the direct supervisors are held responsible for the conduct of their troops, and therefore, every day they're in there getting reports back and forth, taking small corrective action to make sure that the guys and gals on the ground are doing it according to Hoyle, was my understanding of what that meant. I'm wondering, Professor Walker and the others of you that are familiar with that concept, is that part of what you're talking about when you're talking about responsive policing, or however you referred to it?
Yes, absolutely. Really, a sergeant with 8, 10, however many officers under his or her command, that's the heart and soul of policing. That's where the action is, and that's where we need to focus on. And so it's what those sergeants do. And so whatever happened in Oakland to enhance that is absolutely important, and if not essential.
Please.
But supervisors only became interested in changing policies around police use of lethal force under the threat of legal action and the cost.
Sure.
And it has to be a good cop, bad cop system with the cops. Legalized accountability plus supervision is what changed things around police use of lethal force in the 70s and 80s. No one was listening to Fife and NYPD until Monell claims started to happen. And then, facing the threat of a Monell claim, police departments changed.
Well, what could substitute then? What could substitute? You're not going to be able to put every bad police department, I'm assuming not all police departments are bad, but the bad ones, you're not going to be able to put all of them in receivership the way they, and it certainly is an expensive and long-lived undertaking. What could substitute for that leverage, that force that they were able to bring to bear through the court order of the judge? I mean, what are the other levers that could make that possible?
In the end, police departments, communities get the police departments they deserve. And when you find bad police departments, it's because not just the elected officials, but the civic leaders, people who have influence over the community, take up this issue and say, we don't want this bad policing to continue. We want something different. And once you set on that road, you have no trouble finding some people who would be good police chiefs. There's no shortage of experts who can help a department. A community can raise private monies from private foundations to support that effort. You've heard from most of the experts, a lot of the experts on today's hearings. So in the end, it really comes down to the people in a community. Because even if you get a consent decree, after 5 years or however years, it goes away, the federal judge goes away, the monitor goes away, they're on their own. And it's what the people in that community want.
Commissioner Harriet?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've just got a couple of little questions, mostly for Dr. Umbach. I know you're getting a lot of this today, but that just happens that way. First one, on the college education point, does it break down by major in any way? Because what I'm concerned about is, are we talking about people who are learning something specifically that's helping them to become a police officer, or are we just talking about a population of people who have managed to like get up and get to their 9 o'clock class, had enough sense of responsibility that they made it through a 4-year program?
Doesn't matter what you major in. There's absolutely no impact.
Do you think that's then my theory, that maybe it's just simply people that get a college education?
It's a mysterious alchemy, what happens to a student in college, but it makes a difference.
Okay. You mentioned that increasing the number of African American officers doesn't seem to reduce or doesn't reduce by very much the use of force. Is there any data on Asian officers, on Hispanic officers?
So in the Southwest, increasing the number of Latino officers actually increases the use of lethal force. Because there's tensions between recently arrived migrants and native-born or long-standing Latino communities. We talk about that as a Southwest exception. I know of no research about Asians. It might be out there. I don't know it. So yes, that's the answer to that question.
Is there non-Southwest evidence on Hispanic?
So outside of the Southwest, the experience with Latinos is the same as with African Americans. Increasing the Latino share of the police department makes either no or very little impact on the police use of lethal force or excessive force.
What about empirical evidence on training, particular kinds of training? Is there empirical evidence that suggests that certain training does work, certain training doesn't work? What do we got there?
I'll defer to my colleagues on the panel who seem to have more experience with police training than I do.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on that?
There isn't a whole lot, but what I will say is Jim Fife, whose name has been brought up a few times, he ran a study in Dade County, Florida back in the mid-1980s. And to make a long story short, it's the one controlled experiment I'm aware of where we're able to demonstrate that officers who went through the training program used less force than the officers who didn't.
Okay.
Okay. Commissioner Narasaki?
Thank you. I have one theory that maybe because people in college learn to deal with a much broader, diverse set of other students and maybe where they come from, that might help them have actually better skills in de-escalating. But I'm just making that up. So I have a few things. One is for Ms. McDonald. I have to say that, I agree with your point that we should really care what's happening with African Americans. I was pleased to see the administration really lead on a new initiative focused on black men and boys and get both corporations and the philanthropic community more involved in trying to figure out how can we support to make sure they succeed. I think where I part company with you is the notion that somehow it's just about families and the lack of men, because as we know, we have a growing number of divorced families in all communities, and I hate to think that that's going to mean that we just are facing a slew of problems. I would invite you to consider that part of it is perhaps the persistence of poverty, the growing resegregation of schools, the kind of schools that minorities are ending up in Philadelphia. They've closed so many high schools that now there aren't even enough desks for the students going into those schools. So I think there are a lot more issues than family structure. I think there's some public policy issues that have not helped along the way. And I do think that this focus on policing and the relationship of police to minority communities is actually is actually not unrelated to the issue. And that is this, is that to the extent that we don't address the problem of relationships with minority communities and police, the minority communities that we agree require and deserve enforcement by law enforcement to help protect these families, what we see is a growing disengagement from the communities themselves and being able to be effective partners with police. If they don't trust police, they're not going to report, they're not going to be witnesses, there are a lot of things that are going to break down in what happens in the ability of law enforcement to do its job. So I don't see it as totally an either-or proposition as I'm concerned that you may see it as. We had a lot of testimony today that, in fact, part of the challenge is the discriminatory enforcement on the war of drugs, right? Many former policemen testified that even though there are high prevalence of drugs in more prosperous white communities, that's not where the police was going, right? Because the police didn't want to tangle with families who could defend themselves and make their life a challenge if they actually went after their kids. So then they targeted black kids. We heard testimony today that, in fact, in this whole stopping of overstopping and frisking of minority kids, you in fact saw a higher rate of hits when you search white suspects than when you search minority suspects. And that's because some posited perhaps it's a lazy shortcut to do racial profiling and again just stop all these people, and you have to maybe, because you're concerned about really being able to justify what you did with white kids, you're more likely to actually have done a good job in trying to figure out whether someone has drugs. So I think the way that, what bothers me about the way you're approaching this is leaving out sort of the white part of the equation and really looking at, is police treating communities equally fairly? And that's the challenge, right? Communities need to feel like they've been treated fairly. And at some point, it doesn't actually matter whether the reality is of what police are doing. The perception becomes reality.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and that's what we have to address. So I don't want to engage on that. I have other questions that I want to ask, but I just wanted to lay that out. And I'm sorry that I'm not giving you a chance to defend yourself. I didn't ask a question. So my second question is, so we were talking about, we could come back to it, but I just want to get my other questions out because I know the chair is going to cut me off.
That's right.
So on the issue of de-escalation, what I wanted to ask is, so tasers, right, the use of tasers has been raised as sort of a step short of deadly force. But I've heard concerns about use of tasers may in fact sometimes be deadly because of the way they react to people with certain physical conditions. And also some concern, and I've heard that there might be studies, but I haven't found them yet, that police are in fact more likely to escalate to using a taser than they might be to using a gun, rather than de-escalating when they could have as an alternative, because they see tasing as, you know, less harmful, even though it clearly looks very painful. So I wanted to ask whether there was in fact research on that issue, and whether you had thoughts about that in how you do de-escalation.
Well, I think there are some departments where the taser became an add-on. They were in fact using it when they otherwise could have settled the encounter without it. But I think there are others that where the overall use of force went down, and especially the deadly force and so on. So it comes down to the administration of that department. Did they have a clear policy and policy guidance for the officers, and did they enforce it?
Okay, so it comes down to training and policy. Okay, and then my last question is that to Mr. Klinger. You mentioned in your testimony that organizational inertia is a barrier that has to be overcome. And how do we do that? Because it seems to me that, and we've been saying this all day, right, that many of the recommendations that are out there are pretty practical, right, and have been around for a while, and yet it's not happening, it's not spreading, it hasn't gone viral yet. What is it going to take for a majority of police departments to be doing all the things they need to be doing? What's the barrier? What needs to happen for that to happen?
Even though I've talked about granite, I share Sam's optimism, and we have to have both carrots and sticks, and we have to explain to police executives, people are concerned, and we have evidence from other industries. Once again, coining one of Sam's terms, law enforcement is an industry. We have evidence from other industries that if you create mindful employees and you hold them to account and you create a safety culture, what will happen is law enforcement will be safer for the law enforcement officers and the use of force will go down. Because what we're going to do is we're going to structure our encounters in a better way. And you keep getting that message out and you keep getting that message out. And that is the argument that says this is what professional policing is. And we are going to reward you in terms of the IACP starts putting out rewards for agencies that are on top of things in terms of safety culture. And then the federal government can come in, state government can come in and kneecap, metaphorically, organizations and police leaders who aren't doing this. And one of the things is states can start taking control in terms of your post, police officer standard and training for your state. This is what we expect. If you want to get the state certificate, the state post certificate, to be a supervisor, to be a chief, whatever the case might be, you have to have these forms of training. If not, you're out.
Amen.
So is that how you get around? Because I have to say this panel has restored some optimism, because one of the earlier panels was talking about the thin blue line and how you really couldn't, it was too dangerous for good cops to, report on things that were going wrong by other cops, and that in fact even if you put incentives there, it'd be so dangerous because the other cops would retaliate by not backing that cop up when they got in a dangerous situation, which, led me to believe if police are actually afraid of each other, then I don't even know how we get to.
If that's the case, that's a serious problem. I've never heard of that to that extent, but if it's there, it's there.
So how do you break through that?
Well, my argument is that what they were talking about is good cops being afraid to roll on bad cops. My argument is the bad cops are a very small portion of the problem. The problem is bad tactics, people not being able to think strategically, people not being able to think tactically. That's not an issue where someone is going to face discipline. It's the corrective action that Sam is talking about. But once again, the sergeant, the lieutenant, the captain, up and down the chain, they have to understand what appropriate tactical performance is. And you started out in the academy, right? Next week, every police academy is going to teach us in the country. 5 years from now, that's going to be the new granite. If you don't do these things, you will not get promoted in this police department. You will not have an opportunity to lateral to another police department. One of the first things I would do, most police agencies hire chiefs. Most smaller agencies hire chiefs who are captains or maybe a commander or another police agency. Start interviewing people not based upon touchy-feely stuff. Hey, tell me how you are going to handle a barricaded gunman. Tell me how it is that you are going to have your officers handle felony vehicle stops. Tell me how it is that your officers are going to be handling domestic disputes. And if they don't know the basic tactics and they don't understand how the review process should roll, then you don't hire that chief. And if that becomes the new standard, then that'll be the new standard, because people are going to start training themselves and getting the appropriate mindset because they want to be chief somewhere.
Okay, so I will defer to the chair about whether there's time to let Ms.
No, actually, I'm
Okay.
going to wrap it up now. We have come to the appointed time, literally on time. But let me just say that, first of all, thanks to all the panelists. And what we heard throughout the day was fascinating. We saw many aspects from many different points of view and some very unique suggestions for solutions, others that surprise us. So, for example, Marcus Aurelius said that poverty is the mother of crime. But today we heard that single mothers may be the mother of crime. Yet if you look at statistics put forward by the Women's Legal Defense and Education Fund, it shows that in 2013, single parents were 3% of the single parents were Asian, 23% Hispanic, 28% Black, yet 46% non-Hispanic white. But the beauty of having our own civil rights analysts now is that the data that we've collected from you, we are now going to have our own analysts be able to look more closely at some of that data and see where we go. So we're very pleased to have the information you presented to us. We are now going to take this information, the additional research from our staff, and put out a report based on what we believe to be the findings and recommendations that a majority of the commission will make. So again, thank you all for being here. I also want to thank our staff, as did Commissioner Cladney at the beginning, particularly Angela French-Bell and Pam Dunstan and their team on putting together this tremendous off-site for us hearing. Yeah, you can give them a round of applause. They deserve it. Lastly, the record for this briefing report is going to remain open for the next 30 days. So if panelists, members of the public, those who may be watching us via live stream, would like to mail their comments to us, they can do so to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Office of Federal Civil Rights Evaluation, 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Suite 1150, Washington, D.C. 20425, or via email at puf_briefingcomments@usccr.gov. That's PUF, and that stands for Police Use of Force. PUF_briefingcomments@usccr.gov. It is currently 6:01 p.m. Eastern, and I am hereby adjourning this hearing. Thank you.